Okay, welcome everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization Cloud Review, here to moderate the first session as well as welcome you to our Top Ransomware Attacks and Prevention Strategies Summit, brought to you by Rubrik. Before we start today's three-session event, we do have some announcements. First, we want to let you know this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. Also, each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you by our experts. And during today's third session, we will be giving away a Next-Base 4K dash cam bundle. But you must be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from our sponsor, Rubrik, available on the console right now. So please download and check those out. It's because of Rubrik underwriting this summit that we can bring you this great content, so we thank them for supporting the community and ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events in the future. Now on to the first session of today's summit, the top ransomware threats you're facing right now. This session features Alan Liska, an intelligence analyst. Alan has regularly appeared on PBS NewsHour, CNN, ABC, NBC, and CBS, and has been quoted in the Financial Times, Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. He has written many articles about ransomware and co-wrote the book Ransomware, Defending Against Digital Extortion. He is also the author of The Practice of Network Security, Building an Intelligence-Led Security Program, and Securing NTP, a Quick Start Guide. And he's the co-author of DNS Security, Defending the Domain Name System. Alan, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Thanks, David. It's great to be here, and thank you all for attending today. I always love these events, and especially the Q&A at the end. So, hopefully we'll generate a lot of questions and a lot of discussion from our presentation. So, as David said, I'm a ransomware researcher at Recorded Future. I'm also author of the book Ransomware, Understand, Prevent, Recover, now in its second edition. Unfortunately or fortunately, I'm very much immersed in where we are with ransomware. So I want to start with numbers because that's the thing that people always like. Where are we compared to previous years in terms of publicly reported ransomware attacks? So looking through June 15th of 2021, there were about 1,087 publicly reported ransomware attacks through June 15th of 2022, 1,264. And as you can see so far in 2023, through June 15th, 1,763 publicly reported ransomware attacks. And we think only about 10 to 20% of ransomware attacks ever make it to public reporting. So the real number of ransomware attacks so far in 2023 is obviously a lot higher. What we're doing here is we're talking about data that has been posted to ransomware extortion sites. That's something that everybody can see and everybody can share, and these are numbers that we can all agree on. But clearly it's really bad and significantly worse than the previous 2 years at this time. So ransomware attacks are not slowing down. Unfortunately, they do seem to be accelerating this year. In 2023, we're looking at a little bit of a divergence in the ransomware market in terms of the number of different groups that are out there. So if you look at the different groups that are out there, you can see that in the bottom left, Lockbit really accounts for the majority of attacks, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Almost a third of publicly reported attacks are attributed to Lockbit, but there are a number of others that are really kind of coming on this year. So we see Play Ransomware, we see AlpB, which also is known as Black Hat, really accounting for a lot of attacks. Royal Ransomware is accounting for a lot of attacks. Being Lean, which is the old PISA group. They've renamed themselves as Being Lean. Kind of a fascinating group in terms of when they were PISA, they claimed to be that they were based in Mexico, and now they claim to be based in China. They're not. They're based in Russia. So kind of unusual, but still have been very prolific this year. So, if you look at all of this, and Clop's been in the news a lot this last week, they're accounting for 6.5%. But we also have a lot of smaller groups that are, doing a handful of attacks a month, not really getting a lot of attention, and that's kind of by design. They're trying to kind of stay under the radar. So when you look at Stormus or Akira, those are kind of the smaller groups that aren't really adopting sort of the affiliate model and bringing in lots of people. They're staying small and staying focused. Industries, one of the things that people always ask is, what industries are ransomware groups going after? And hopefully, as you can see from this, they're going after all the industries. There really isn't an industry that is not impacted by ransomware, because ransomware is not a targeted attack in the way that we normally think of targeted attacks. So when we talk about targeted attacks, we normally are talking about nation-state actors that are going after specific industries or specific organizations intending to disrupt them. Ransomware actors, when they go after things, they're looking for vulnerabilities they can exploit, whether that's a technical vulnerability in software or a human vulnerability in terms of good phishing content, et cetera. So it doesn't matter what industry you're in; it's whether or not you're vulnerable to their type of attack. There are a couple of exceptions that we see. Manufacturing has been hit really hard in 2023, and a lot of that, again, is the type of vulnerabilities that ransomware actors like to exploit. Manufacturing is particularly vulnerable to. The legal sector has also been hit hard this year. Ransomware actors love it when they can get into law firms and other parts of the legal sector, because they know that sensitive data is going to be really valuable, whether it's valuable to use in extortion or whether it is valuable to sell if the victim refuses to pay the ransom. Education's another one. Education's a weird one because most schools who are hit with ransomware attacks don't pay a ransom, so it's not a profitable attack, but attacks on schools get a lot of attention, and ransomware actors really like that attention. It draws attention to their group, gets them more affiliates, gets them more people that want to sign up to be part of their group. The other thing with education is especially schools, hold a lot of sensitive data. That sensitive data is really valuable in underground forums. And so if you can't get a ransom payment from the schools, being able to sell that student data in underground forums can be really valuable. But broadly speaking, every sector is being hit by ransomware attacks. There is no sector that is really safe unless you are based in Russia. Then you have a little more safety. So everybody unfortunately has to worry about ransomware attacks. We are seeing a couple of new tactics used by ransomware actors in 2023. The first one is mass vulnerability exploitation. So, this is sort of one of those everything old is new again. We saw this a little bit with WannaCry and NotPetya in 2017, and now we're seeing ransomware actors do this again. There have been 3 big mass exploitation campaigns in 2023. We started the year off with the ESXi ransomware, which targeted exposed ESXi servers that have OpenSLP enabled. And again, that was just a ransomware actor scanning for vulnerabilities, finding vulnerable systems, didn't matter where they were or what companies they were, exploiting and encrypting. And then we've had CLOP launch 2 ransomware attacks against targeting the Go Anywhere software and targeting Move It software. Both of these are file transfer software, which means that they hold a lot of sensitive data. So that's perfect for ransomware actors that want the data to hold at ransom. Both of these attacks were data theft attacks. They were not encrypt and data theft. So that means that CLOP wasn't interested in encrypting any of the data on the instances of the Go Anywhere or the Move It. Instead, they just wanted to get the data off and then use the fact that they had the data as their extortion leverage. We'll talk a little bit more about this attack model in a couple of slides, but this is really indicative of the kind of attack that we're seeing. These attacks are a lot faster. It's kind of like knocking over a liquor store. You can get in and you can get out very quickly. And because it's a 0-day, the usual advice of, hey, are you patched and so on doesn't necessarily apply. So they can hit hundreds or thousands of these in a few-week period and then hold that data hostage. And in fact, we're still seeing the fallout from the Move It attack as CLOP over this last few days has been slowly releasing some of that data. The other thing that this is indicative of is ransomware actors have been really interested in finding 0-day vulnerabilities, and because they've made so much money, they have the funds to purchase these vulnerabilities. But if you look at, or hire people who can then find the vulnerabilities, but if you look at the big things, so if you look at like Microsoft Exchange or like the Apache web server or Microsoft IIS or something like that, it is really hard to find vulnerabilities in there because so many people look at them. So what the ransomware actors are doing is they're looking at kind of ubiquitous but under-noticed software platforms. So most people have never heard of Go Anywhere or Move It prior to these attacks, but that's exactly the kind of software that these ransomware groups go after, because you can find a 0-day vulnerability or buy a 0-day vulnerability for 5 figures instead of 7 figures. So, $50,000, $100,000 to get a 0-day vulnerability in these platforms versus millions of dollars to get a vulnerability in Microsoft Exchange or Microsoft IIS or any of the more well-known internet-facing tools. So we expect to see more of this going forward. These kind of platforms are going to be increasingly targeted by ransomware groups who are very, very well funded. Some ransomware groups have a bigger budget than some nation-state groups do, and that is a problem going forward for their ability to carry out these attacks and your ability to defend against them. One of the other things we're starting to see is that ransomware as a service is going away. So for the last several years, a lot of growth in ransomware has been driven by ransomware as a service. And the way ransomware as a service works, if you're not familiar, is I have a ransomware. I like having my ransomware, but I want to make even more money. So I rent out my ransomware infrastructure to other threat actors who give me a cut of whatever ransom they make. And more specifically, I collect all the ransoms and then I give them their cut. So what will happen is if David signs up to be one of my affiliates, which is what they call themselves, I'm not putting that name out there, but if David signs up to be one of my affiliates, he successfully exploits the company. They reach out to the infrastructure that I own. The victim does. We negotiate a ransom payment of $1 million. I keep $200,000. I give David $800,000. And that structure has really helped grow a lot of ransomware starting in roughly 2018, but really taking off in 2019, 2021, and even part of 22. The problem has been when ransomware groups get too big, they tend to go boom. So we see this over and over again with Revil, with Hive, with Dark Matter. Famously, Dark Matter took down Colonial Pipeline, was really, really proud of themselves until they got called out by, the president in a primetime speech. And then they were like, they kind of had an oh crap moment, rightfully so. And so again, we're seeing this pattern repeatedly where these ransomware actors get really big, and then they get on the radar of government agencies, and in particular the now 46 country ransomware task force, and those countries share intelligence and do what they can to bring down these ransomware groups. And we're seeing this over and over again. So like in January is a great example where you had 27 countries contribute to the takedown of the Hive ransomware group. And these are 27 countries that can't agree on anything, but they all hate ransomware, and they all hate ransomware actors. And so seeing that kind of government action is really having an impact on the ability for larger ransomware groups to survive. The one exception to that being Lockbit. So this is a report that Lockbit or that CISA came out with earlier this week, kind of going through Lockbit and all of the tools and techniques. The URLs in there, I highly, highly recommend reading through that report. There's a lot of really good advice for how to protect yourself. But Lockbit has been a big problem. Now, this slide deck was put together earlier this week. Yesterday, the FBI did announce another Lockbit arrest. So that's the third Lockbit arrest in 3 years. This was a Russian-based threat actor who made the mistake of visiting Arizona. You do not, if you are a member of Lockbit, you do not want to leave Russia, because if you leave Russia, you will get arrested. And that's what keeps happening is members of Lockbit think that they're going to be safe, and so they've arrested one in Romania, they've arrested one in Poland, and now this guy in Arizona. The truth is, even though they don't talk about it, the governments know who these people are. They can't do anything while they're in Russia, but as soon as they step foot out of Russia, because all of these different countries are cooperating with the ransomware task force, that information is shared. Those bad guys are picked up, and they will spend a very, very long time in jail. So, slowly the governments, I should say, are eating away at some of these ransomware groups. Unfortunately, in the meantime, it's a little bit like whack-a-mole where, yes, they're taking down some of these groups, but then other groups kind of step in to fill the void, and that's why we continue to see the growth of ransomware attacks. So with the disappearance of a lot of these bigger RAS groups, one of the things that we are seeing right now is an increase in what I call Franken ransomware. And there's a lot of stolen code out there. And so this is really stolen and leaked code, I should say. And this is really where we kind of are right now, where if I were to start a new ransomware today and I didn't want to build one from scratch because that's expensive, and I didn't want to join a RAS group because I didn't want to go to jail, then what I would do is I would look at some of the stolen code and I would start building out my own ransomware using stolen code. That way I don't have to build from scratch. I already have code that's done. And so if I want to have a small little ransomware group, just me and 3 of my buddies, we sit around, drink vodka, and do ransomware all day, there's enough stolen code out there that I can do that. Shababook is a great example of ransomware that's been used in dozens. The core code has been used in dozens of other what we call new ransomware families because they're separate from the original actors involved in Babook, but they're still using the same Babook code. Same thing with Chaos. Chaos is another one that is another one that we're seeing a lot of. So Chaos ransomware is again a freely available code, and it is not as reliable as other ransomware groups, but it's really easy to bolt other stuff onto, and so that's why we have to be really careful when we're doing incident response, because you don't know if you're going to run into one of these kind of Franken ransomware families that is that's built on Chaos code or one of these other code bases that don't always recover very well. So you have to think about that when you're doing incident response and when you're planning your incident response. Hey, can we verify that all of this works if we have to pay a ransom, or are we just going to be, completely screwed and kind of have to start from scratch on some of these things? So the last thing I'll talk about in terms of new activities is we're seeing more and more groups move to an extortion-only model rather than an encryption and extortion model. So basically, the ransomware actors will get into the network the same way that we're going to talk about in the next slide, but rather than encrypt everything, all they do is steal data. With that stolen data, they are, they then hold that data hostage and threaten to release it unless you pay a ransom. This is a lot easier for the ransomware actors to carry out. They can go through more victims, and that extortion model has worked well for them in the past. One kind of new development that we had been seeing, but the first report about came out yesterday. If you don't follow the DFIR report, it's a great website, and they released this report yesterday. We had seen this mentioned in a few places, but not publicly. But now we can talk about it publicly. So you're getting breaking news, I guess. Congratulations. One of the problems with the extortion-only model is it's not nearly as profitable as encrypt and extort, because one of the reasons that organizations felt compelled to pay was that their workflow was disrupted. Well, if your workflow is not disrupted, you just have data stolen, you're going to be less likely to pay. So we're starting to see more of these groups. We say data theft, but really it's data copy, right? Because the original data is still left behind. And that's what we're starting to see change, is some of these groups are moving to wipe and steal, or steal then wipe. So what that means is they don't encrypt data, they just secure delete it from the network so that the data is no longer there. And unless you have good backups, you're then forced to pay in order to get your data back. So not every data theft group is doing that, but we expect we'll start to see more of those, because we think those eventually will be more profitable for the groups than what we're seeing now. So what does the ransomware attack look like? There's actually generally multiple parts to a ransomware attack. You have the initial access, and that's often carried out by one group. That's different than the actual ransomware actor. These are generally called initial access brokers, and it's either independent people or you can rent their infrastructure or whatever. Attacks that we see right now, phishing, credential stuffing reuse, through third-party attacks, exploitation, obviously we talked a lot about that, social engineering, and insider threat. Those are kind of the big ways that they get initial access. But generally the way it works is one team gets initial access, or an independent contractor gets initial access, and then they will then either sell the access, or if they're contracted out to a specific ransomware group, they'll hand over the access. Once that happens, the ransomware actor who has the access will then move around the network. They need to map the network. They need to get admin access, admin control, so they need to get to the domain controller. And then they will push, they will steal the data that they need, so the exfiltration. They will push the ransomware actor if it is a, steal and encrypt versus just steal. They will push the ransomware out to the servers, and then they will generally hand that over. If it is a ransomware as a service operation, they'll hand it over to the owner of the RAS, who will handle the negotiations and then take care of money laundering and payments from there. So you're dealing with, in the first section, you're dealing with one threat actor. In the second section, another threat actor, and you may be dealing with another threat actor in the third section, depending on what the group is and what their model is. This process can take a while. So initial access, somebody gets initial access, especially if they're independent, they will have to find a buyer for it. That process, they'll have to have the transaction and so on. In the meantime, they're holding that initial access. Once you get in the network, generally it's a few days to a week or so that between initial access, between when you land in the network and when you're ready to deploy the ransomware. And then depending on how busy the ransomware group is, getting data uploaded to an extortion site, handling negotiation, et cetera, can take months. That is the way ransomware tends to work. And this model has been fairly effective for the last couple of years. And we've talked in previous webinars about stopping initial access or threat hunting to find the ransomware actors in the network and how you do that. And I'm sure we'll talk as those tactics change. But I thought I'd do something a little different today and talk about how you go about preparing, knowing what the ransomware actor is going to do, how you go about preparing yourself for protecting and against these kind of attacks. So I know that this quote is overused by a lot of InfoSec people, but I still think it applies here. Everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth by Mike Tyson. And in information security, that ransomware attack is the ultimate punch in the mouth. And that is, and so that really gets to test all your planning and everything that you've lined up to see whether or not, whether or not you've lined everything up appropriately. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And many organizations think that they are prepared for a ransomware attack. Unfortunately, you don't get to find out that how unprepared you are until the attack happens. I can't, in the next 20 or so minutes, tell you everything you need to know to plan for attack. What I can do is tell you what you need to think about and how you need to think about protecting yourself and preparing for that ransomware attack. And then you can take whatever is, you can kind of take whatever steps you need to from this and build on that inside your own organization. So I think this should be obvious, but good incident response starts long before the attack ever happens. So what you really need to think about is, what do you need to prepare for a ransomware attack? You know now what a ransomware attack looks like. What do you need to do in order to prepare in case your security controls fail? What data will you need to conduct an effective incident response? I was helping out an organization just a couple weeks ago that had built a really thorough and effective ransomware incident response plan, knowing that they could get hit at some point. Unfortunately, they left that ransomware incident response plan on someone's laptop, and that laptop was encrypted as part of the attack. So they didn't have their incident response plan. So thinking about that, not just what data, but where that data can be stored, how you can make sure that it's not going to be encrypted as part of the attack. And then what personnel will be needed to carry out the response. Ransomware attacks are generally an all hands on deck type situation, because recovery is so important and getting recovery right is so important. But you have to move fast. You have to move quickly in order to do that, and that generally means having a lot of people around who are trained that can help get things going. So not just internally, but what is your third-party presence look like? Who are you bringing in to help? If you are going to need outside help, have you put in a contract with a company that can provide that outside help? The last thing you want to do in the middle of in the middle of a ransomware attack is try negotiating a retainer with an incident response firm. So you want to have that lined up ahead of time. Now, a lot of companies rely on their insurance company. Maybe your cyber insurance company has people, and that's great. That is absolutely a good way to go, but you need to know that in advance. You need to reach out to your cyber insurance provider and say, hey, if we're hit with ransomware, what do you bring to the table? What do you provide? So I know what else I need to provision. So something to really think about there is who all you're going to need involved, how you get a hold of them, and making sure that all the paperwork and everything is done so that when you call them, they can just show up. You don't have to get lawyers involved. And then again, when you're building out that plan, you can't do it in isolation. You can't do any of the things we're going to talk about over the next few slides in isolation. You need to make sure that the people who are involved are, you need to make sure the people who are involved know that they're involved, know what their role is, and know how to help going forward. So again, you don't want on the day of the attack trying to herd people through the chaos. You want them to know what their roles and responsibilities are. So in 2023 specifically, some new things you need to think about for your ransomware incident response plan if you haven't updated recently. What do you do when you're hit with a 0-day? Like, how do you handle that? Because if you have a great patching program in place, that doesn't help you if there's a 0-day. What are your other ways of detecting this kind of attack, especially when what we're seeing is 0-day being used to steal data, right? Or deploy 0-day and then steal data. And so how are you prepared to A, detect that, but B, respond if you miss it for some reason? And then the other thing is, and we didn't even get a chance to really talk about this, but what if it's a nation-state actor? We are seeing more nation-state groups, especially coming out of Iran and North Korea, deploying ransomware as part of their targets. These are sanctioned entities. You may need to get a lawyer involved before you even start the negotiation, and certainly you may not want to pay them because there would be a sanctions violation. How do you do that? What's the difference between how you handle a ransomware attack, so an encrypt and extort attack, versus just a data theft and extortion attack? How are you going to respond differently? Along the lines of that, what I've seen, a lot of times is when an organization refuses to pay, what the ransomware group does is they reach out to your clients or your partners or other people, anybody that's mentioned in those documents, and say, hey, I have your sensitive data that I stole from company X. They're not paying me, so I need you to pay me, or I need you to tell them that they need to pay me. Side notes, it's always amazing to me how indignant ransomware actors get when people don't pay them. Like, you're the criminal, you jackass. You shouldn't get paid. You don't get to be upset that people don't want to pay you. But there is this real sense of entitlement amongst these ransomware groups that, oh my God, you didn't pay me, you're a terrible person, not, oh, hey, maybe I should rethink my life choices. But anyway, that's a complete side note. And then how do you determine with so many new groups that are out there, how do you determine whether or not you can even trust working with this group? You already can't trust ransomware actors to start with. And then some of these newer groups are even less trustworthy than the current untrustworthy ransomware groups that are out there. So how do you know who you're dealing with? How do you know that they can actually be trusted? They will give you assurances up and down that, yeah, of course you can trust us. We always make sure that we help people recover. Yeah, they may be lying to you. So again, these are all things that if you haven't updated your ransomware incident response plan in a while, you may need to add that to your list of contingencies. So a lot of the things that we are going to talk about today are information sharing, multi-factor authentication, network segmentation, patching, endpoint detection response, backups, encryption, and tabletop exercises. The information sharing in particular, I think, is important because there are so many different ISAC centers now, information sharing and information sharing and analysis centers for different segments. So retail has one, religious groups have one, the financial ISAC, aviation ISAC, et cetera. If you are in one of the sectors that has an ISAC, I do highly recommend joining. They tend to provide really, really good information and information that nobody else has because it's all sector specific. Even though ransomware broadly isn't a sector specific attack, there may be software that is in your sector that's not widely used outside of it that's being exploited by ransomware groups. So these are things that you want to think about. Again, you want to be part of that information sharing, and you really want to, you can grab a lot of really useful data, but you can also help contribute, especially if you're a victim of a ransomware attack. You can help make the next organization safer, and I think that's a really important thing that we can do here. Multi-factor authentication. We've been talking about this for a while. Is really, really important to do that, especially because so many attacks are originating with credential stuffing, credential reuse attacks. So having that multi-factor authentication goes a long way to stopping some of these ransomware attacks. Is it enough? No, there are ways around multi-factor authentication. A lot of the ransomware actors have figured some of that out, but it makes it a lot harder for them to get in, which means you are much more likely to detect that initial access. So it's a combination of knowing how your authentication process works and training employees to look for things like, oh, hey, IT will never call you and ask you for your multi-factor authentication number. Or if you start seeing a bunch of push notifications from our MFA tool, that may be an attack. So that combination of having multi-factor authentication and then training employees about what's odd when in multi-factor authentication, things that are unexpected. So having multi-factor authentication at this point is sort of basic table stakes, kind of like good vulnerability management, good asset management. Multi-factor authentication at a minimum should be there. Network segmentation, I don't see enough of this. And you really want to do a better job of segmenting networks. I know it's hard. I know setting up good network segmentation makes things more difficult. You have to have more complex networks, and network complexity is never good. But networks are a ransomware actor's best friend. I see this especially in towns and cities where, a ransomware actor will get in through somebody who opens a phishing email in the mayor's office, and then from the mayor's office, they're able to encrypt the court system and the police network, and those networks shouldn't be talking to each other, and yet they are. Really, really important. I know we talk a lot about network segmentation when we talk about industrial control systems. Obviously, that's really important. But even just your everyday network, segmenting the different departments and so on, goes a long way to slowing down and even stopping ransomware groups, isolating the attack to one part of the network instead of allowing the whole network to kind of run through. So, enabling better network segmentation is really important, and it also allows you to continue operating through a ransomware attack and through a compromise. Update and patch systems promptly. This is, again, one of those things that we've been saying for years and years, and I know it's a lot easier to say than it is to do. There's so many patches out there. I really like CISA's KEV list, known exploited vulnerabilities list. That is a great list for, hey, let's prioritize patching things, because that's really what we're talking about here is, yes, eventually you want to patch everything, but how do you prioritize which systems to be patched? Just this week, there's the Fortinet vulnerability that needs to be patched. There's the Barracuda networks vulnerability that can't even be patched. You have to send your things back to Barracuda. Obviously, with the MoveIt vulnerability, that needs to be patched. These are all really high priority systems that need to be patched immediately. How do you know which of these systems are when you're constantly being hit with new vulnerability alerts? How do you know which systems need to be patched immediately? And knowing how to prioritize is really important. You really want to make sure that you that you are patching everything that you can in a prioritized way that makes sense. So systems exposed to the internet should obviously be like number one priority for patching, but then anything else that is known to be exploited, that's sort of secondary priority and so on down the list. So handling your patching with a risk-based assessment of the threat and a realistic assessment of the threat is important going forward, but patching, again, goes a long way to stopping some of these attacks. Endpoint detection and response. EDR can be great for stopping ransomware attacks because ransomware actors reuse a lot of the same tools because the tools work really well. And if you have a well-tuned EDR, you can detect and stop a lot of these attacks. And, you can build out rule-based capability based on knowing what the threat actors like to do and how they like to do it. But EDR does take a lot of care and feeding, and you tend to be need to be a larger organization to implement EDR. But if you have it, EDR definitely goes a long way toward for keeping your organization safe. And you absolutely want to have EDR in place if it's something that your organization can afford, and if it's something you can afford to maintain. This is where a lot of managed security services providers come in because a lot of them can handle the deployment and maintenance of an EDR tool for you. So that allows you to focus on what your business does really well. Again, really, really great for detecting it, but you have to have the right network size and capability. Backups, again, when we talk about ransomware, we've talked about backups forever. In particular, with the idea going forward that the data theft is going to include wiping the drive, backups give you the option to not have to even negotiate with the ransomware actor. You can just say, you know what, the data's out there. They claim they're going to delete it. I don't believe them. So yes, go ahead and go ahead and expose it to the world. It sucks, but we'll deal with that. But at least if you can restore the data because you have good backups, you put you in more control. And that's why backups are so important. It's not going to stop a ransomware attack. It is something that's just going to give you options after a ransomware attack. I will say that ransomware actors will go after your backups. So make sure you have at least one immutable copy of your backups, one that can't be overwritten, one that can't be encrypted, one that can't be touched. And that immutable copy can be a tape drive. I know a lot of people are down on tape as a backup option, but if it's something you have and it's what your organization can afford, I've never seen a ransomware actor able to encrypt backups on tape. I know that it's slow to restore the data, but at least the data is there. So backups, again, really important and something that you want to keep that you want to keep going and making sure that the backups are actually working and so on. And then we really, really want to talk about having a good and updated incident response plan specific for ransomware. Your incident response plan, you probably have an incident response plan, but you may need one specific for ransomware because of the unique nature of a ransomware campaign. So how are you going to handle that versus other incidents? You want to not only have this plan, you also want to test this. And you want to test this not just in isolation, but with representatives from all the different parts of your organization that are going to be involved, and most importantly, with leadership. You want leadership there because you are undoubtedly making certain assumptions, and you want to make sure leadership signs off on those assumptions. So you want to have the CEO or the CTO or somebody like that who can say, yes, this is all good. I've seen this happen before where I've seen this happen before where the ransomware act or where a ransomware attack will happen, recovery starts, and there's no plan, and everybody thinks their data is the first priority, and to them it is. And so if you don't have that plan in place, if you don't say this is the process for restoring everything signed off by senior leadership, then everybody's going to tell you they need their data first. That's not the way it's got to work. It's got to say, yeah, you know what, the boss, big boss says, this is the order we do things. If you don't like it, you can go talk to the big boss. If they change it, we're happy to adjust. That is not our call, and it shouldn't be your call. These are what gets restored first is a business decision. It should be decided by people who, basically run the business. And so that's just one part of this. There are other parts of your plan where you're going to want to do, make sure that your assumptions are right. You may think that the desktop team does one thing and they'll tell you, no, they don't. That's great. You can find that out while you're running through these tests. You may think that certain systems are backed up and it turns out they're not. So having the backup team is really important. And doing these tests on a regular basis is really important. You want to do it at least once a year. I prefer twice a year. I actually prefer quarterly, but getting everybody together in one room quarterly is really, really tough. So half a year is ideal, and then yearly if you don't can't do it half a year. But that gives you the opportunity, if you're doing it twice a year, gives you the opportunity to test out different scenarios to see how you'd react to them. So, definitely you want to be able to test out all of your assumptions that you put together in your incident response plan and make sure everybody agrees to it and so on. And again, I appreciate everybody's time. Thank you so much for, again, another great presentation, another great opportunity to speak with you all. I am happy to answer any questions if there are any that came in from the audience. And if not, David, you and I can just chat for a while.
Well, we do have some questions, so let's just get right to those. First come, first serve. And the first question in the Q&A console says, you mentioned EDR. You mentioned tabletop exercises. Can you expound on who all should be involved in those?
Sure. So you want to bring in everybody who is going to be involved in the recovery process. So that means that, depending on how your organization is laid out, it's going to vary from organization to organization. Obviously the security team is going to be there, but your IT team needs to be there. Your network team needs to be there. You will probably want your PR person. A lot of people forget about PR, but you're going to want, because you may get somebody from the Wall Street Journal sending you questions. Your PR team needs to be there so they know what they should say, not say. You undoubtedly will need your legal team there. Whoever is your legal counsel will need to be there. And then definitely your leadership, because again, I know I said this like 10 times, but you want to make sure they're signing off on everything. So at a bare minimum, you want security, IT, networking, PR, legal counsel, human resources, and leadership at that tabletop exercise. There may be others depending on how your organization is laid out and structured.
Okay, here's a question about EDR. It says, EDR is expensive and many smaller companies can't afford it. What are some other options?
I mentioned using a managed services security provider, or managed security services provider. Thank you, MSSP. I mentioned using that as sort of an alternative because they will often use the power of having all of their customers to get a better deal, and they can deploy EDR for you. But if you can't, if you can't afford an MSSP and you can't afford EDR, good antivirus does work, but you actually have to pay attention to the alerts. That's kind of the big thing. Is a lot of alerts from antivirus get ignored. And then keeping your systems up to date and fully patched. So I'd rather have a well-patched system with an antivirus than a poorly maintained EDR. And so that would be what I'd recommend in that case.
Great last answer, because it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Alan, for an excellent presentation and answering all those questions.
Hey, David, thank you. And thank you, everybody who attended. I really appreciate everybody's time today and looking forward to the other presentations.
Okay, everyone else, stay tuned. We're going to take a short break and be back at the top of the hour for our second session of the day, Best Practices for Protecting Against and Recovering from Ransomware. So take this chance to check out those resources on your console provided by Rubrik, and we'll be right back.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers and moderators, and of course, our sponsor, Rubrik, for underwriting this particular summit today and allowing us to bring you all of this great content. My name is Gladys Lama. I'm the editorial director, and I'm so happy to moderate the second session of our Top Ransomware Attacks and Prevention Strategy Summit. This particular session is called Best Practices for Protecting Against and Recovering from Ransomware. Our speakers for this session, and you may be very familiar with them if you've joined our other summits before, are Dave Kawula, Managing Principal Consultant at Tricon Elite Consulting, as well as John O'Neill Sr., Chief Technologist for AWS Solutions. Dave Kawula is a Microsoft MVP specializing in Microsoft Azure, hybrid cloud, and cybersecurity with over 20 years of experience in the IT industry and as a trusted advisor to organizations of all sizes, helping them navigate the complex world of Microsoft technologies. John is a chief technologist, meanwhile, with more than 25 plus years in IT. He's worked as a consultant, architect, executive speaker, and author, and he's been involved in multinational networking, managing, and communications projects, as well as an author for Thomson Reuters Aspitor books and executive blueprints. And he also develops courseware for Pluralsight. John and Dave, I'm going to give you the floor now.
Awesome. Thank you very much. We're so pleased to be here for the summit. It's always nice to be back. And, I get a chance to present with, my good friend John here. It's been a little while, John. And I'm really excited. This is going to be some great content today, isn't it?
Absolutely. I'm excited to kind of shake the rust off. Like you said, it's been a while since you and I have sat and chatted about these things.
Yeah, for sure. And this topic is just so relevant for all of our attendees today because, the threat landscape as we, started to look at this issue with ransomware 4 or 5 years ago has just been an evolving situation. And, the tips that we're going to have today will hopefully help our attendees and organizations not only try to prevent ransomware, but also have some strategies for how to recover because, the bad guys are really good, John. And, sometimes our defenses aren't going to hold. So having that proper recovery strategy is a definite must. All right, let's get started with the show here. So the first thing that I'd like to do is kind of just introduce the concept of where we are today with ransomware. So John, do you want to maybe just take a brief second on this? I know that you're very heavily involved with, a lot of cybersecurity, cyber insurance underwriters, and you're talking about this on nearly a daily basis. What's that threat landscape look like right now? And, kind of where are we at?
Well, so thanks, Dave. We always start out by saying that the threat landscape continues to evolve. You have been watching it change dramatically over the course of weeks and months and years, but even sometimes days and hour to hour. And that is dramatically affecting cyber insurance, the policies, the retention amounts or the deductibles. All these different things are being very significantly impacted by this evolution of the threat landscape. And what do we mean when we say that? Well, I like to describe it to folks just like any other landscape, right? If I'm standing up on the top of a mountain and I look out, there are things I can see that are very close to me, and they have a lot of detail and structure and definition. And then there are things that are way out on the horizon that I can barely make out, but I definitely know they're there. This is what ransomware and cyber threats in general kind of look like when we take a look at them. There's the things that we've identified. Hey, we know this group is very active, and we know this is the form of malware they're deploying right now, and we know how that malware delivers its payloads and all those things. Those are the things that are very close to us in the landscape. But there's always a ton of things that are lurking that we can't really define the definition, and there are some things that are way off that we can see out there. We know that they're going to be there, but we can't really define them any further than that. There are nation-state-sponsored attacks and syndicates and all sorts of different things that we know are increasing activity, so we know they're out there, but we don't really understand which angle they're going to come at us by or that sort of thing. And, that is not only critical to us being able to implement proper defenses, but also how we strategize about reaction time and those kind of things and negotiate the important parts of our cyber insurance policies I mean, there's things in the cyber landscape now, Dave, such as, the Department of Defense Acts here in the U.S. that literally create a list of companies and products that are linked to the Chinese military and say, hey, if you want to be a contractor or a subcontractor or essentially do anything for a government entity, you can't have any of these products on your network. A big one that I just recently had to deal with is Hikvision. Hikvision is very popular for cameras. People have been buying them left and right. But if you go look, the U.S. has linked them to the Chinese military, and that creates an exclusionary event for some customer relationships, and therefore creates an exclusionary contingency, if you will, with some of your insurance policies. And those are things that are just like nobody thinks to think of them until it's often too late.
Well, and I think that's a really good point, John, because the thing is that we have to remember that insurance companies and what we're buying in regards to cyber insurance, that's a for-profit industry. And they're going to try to find every single way that they possibly can to not have to pay out that $5 or $10 million policy in the event of a whole-level ransomware attack. And so, gone are the days where you can just bury your head in the sand, blindly sign off on an attestation form, and say that you're good. They might underwrite that policy, but if you don't read the fine print, when that event happens, what are you going to do when they don't pay? Who's going to be responsible for that? So, I think as all of us listening and, going through this process, we have to make sure that we're diligent. And one of the big pieces is having proactive protection and recovery strategies. And we're going to talk about this throughout the presentation. But the one thing that I'm going to lead in here with is that your traditional DR plans that you have for fire, flood, natural disaster, earthquake, power outage, things like that, those are not sufficient for a cyber event. You need to have a separate cyber DR recovery policies, procedures, and those need to be tested. And they need to be tested routinely because when it hits the fan, that's not the time you want to start figuring things out. Okay, so back to that.
Because I know somebody asked, what I was specifically referencing, and it's the National Defense Authorization Act. And so you can go look that up and understand that. But to the point you made about being proactive, I think it's worth noting that our actions in recovery and proactive nature and everything else not only define whether we will get paid back or not, but the amount of time it takes. And if it takes your insurance company months and months before they issue you that first check, it may be too little too late, right? So I put it equivalent to if somebody needs CPR now and you're an hour and a half away, odds are it won't matter when you arrive that you know how to give CPR.
No, absolutely. And John, we actually have a question coming in from Bob. Bob, thank you very much. And I actually just want to do some housekeeping for our session. I forgot to do this on the lead-in. We love to have these sessions interactive. So fire away with your questions. We'll try to take as many of them as we can throughout the presentation. But Bob's question is do cameras and connected devices matter? Yeah, absolutely. Anything that's on the network, it matters. And so you got to make sure that you lock those down, you check the vendors and all those other pieces that John was mentioning, and you have to make sure that they're falling under your security and compliance standards. All right, John, so let's talk a little bit about common types of ransom.
Let me add just a little bit to that for Bob, because I just had this question earlier this week also, and there's two things here. One, when it comes to companies and them being linked to foreign threat actors or that sort of thing, they're banning the entire company. And when you go to discuss this, I want you to understand there's no justification. This is like me telling my daughter, and Dave and I both have kids. In fact, we often tell people that between us, we can field pretty much any sports team that you want. And we have daughters. And when we tell them, hey, you need to be home by 11 p.m., and they come waltzing in the door at 2 a.m., and, we're coming out, I'm like, why are you late? What are you doing? And they go, well, but I was with Joni, and you like Joni. That doesn't matter. I didn't say be home by 11 unless you're with Joni or somebody I like or something else. Same kind of scenario here. If they find one of these products that belong to these companies, you don't get to say, but it's just a camera, or but we really don't use it for much or anything. There is no but. And what happens is that choice could end up putting your organization on a blacklist that prevents you from even bidding to these customers. And my recommendation to people is that it's a lot easier to get on these kind of blacklists than it is to get off. So just don't take the behavior. Don't make those kind of choices. Thanks, Dave, for letting me jump in on that.
Yeah, no worries, John. No worries. So I think that, our attendees are very familiar by this point and this juncture with ransomware-based events. Those are ones where, payload's going to be delivered. We're going to have some type of a cipher or encryption that's going to happen on our data. They're going to lock out. They're going to try to hold us hostage with that data. I think everyone kind of understands the gist of how that works in today's world. The scary stuff for me, John, is the state-sponsored attacks where they actually don't even want a payment. They're just out there to, destroy and cause chaos. And then there's also the ransomware-less attacks where it's just data exfiltration, where it's like, you know what? I don't want to actually go through the effort of encrypting all of your data. Your data is the new currency. Your data is gold to me. And, all of that intellectual property that you have for those top secret projects that you're working on, I have them now. And I'm going to release them to the highest bidder, potentially sinking your organization unless you pay. And oh, by the way, if you pay this time, there's no guarantee that I'm not going to come back to you in 2 years and say, hey, I still have your data, because there's no way to confirm that they actually delete that data once they have it. And so that's a huge piece of this is your proactive protection not only needs to be for your data on-prem, you also need to watch every piece of data that's going out of your network. And so that part of data loss prevention, those pieces, those security measures, those also have to be put in place. So, John, can you just speak to, maybe a little bit on that data loss prevention? Because that piece is really scary to me because, once that data goes off your network, you have no control over where it goes.
Absolutely. And, everybody thinks about it in terms of those high-profile news cases where, Apple's working on the next iPhone and somebody happens to leave the prototype in a bar and it has marketing slicks and engineering drawings and wow, all that data is now out there and Apple lost it and that kind of thing. But it can be far more nuanced than that. You could be a manufacturer and you work for a particular customer building a next generation product, and somebody who works out on your plant floor, just working on the maintenance team or whatever, thinks it's really cool and takes a picture and posts it to Facebook. And all of a sudden, your customer is calling saying, hey, you just breached our contract with you, that little fine print, and we're, going to fine you or backcharge you or worst case, cancel. And then you try and turn to your business interruption insurance and say, hey, we invested, $500,000 in getting this up and running already, and now the customer's saying they won't pay us because we did this or whatever, and your insurance company goes, well, we're sorry, you do have business interruption, but it requires you to take certain actions to put in a good faith effort to prevent these kind of things going on. And you go, well, what do you mean? How do I stop people having a cell phone? And the insurance company looks at you and goes, you don't stop them from having a cell phone, but you do stop them from taking them into areas where you're not supposed to be taking pictures or, so I'm kind of just trying to build a scenario for people to see that you have to protect all the information that may, not definitely is, but may be important to you, your partners, your employees, your customers. That's a lot, and it's hard to do. And that's what makes it so scary for me, Dave, is because it requires constant effort and constant vigilance. And yes, we have to rely on technology, like DLP filters built into our firewalls and different things like that, but that isn't enough. we have to start layering these defenses. You and I are always talking to people about layering defenses and building fence line after fence line. Data loss prevention, no different. Layer your defenses.
Yeah, and so one of the questions that I often get back from executives when we're dealing with this, John, is that we're causing a lot of pain to the business. We are taking and slowing down production. We are making it so that, it's almost, the system is almost unusable. And you know what my answer back to this, because I actually just had this question at a customer this week. I had a CIO come back to us and say, what are the things that we can do to stop causing these IT-related outages because you guys are patching so fast and you guys are doing all these things and rebooting servers during the day? And I said, the first thing I have to tell you is clearly you have not been hit by a cyber attack or a ransomware event, because if you did and you saw the damage and the catastrophic chaos that was caused by that, we would not be having this conversation. It would be patch and protect the network at all costs. And so that's the kind of answer that I have going back to the executives, is that, hey, listen, we can back off, but just understand there's a consequence to this. And so if you're prepared for that, that's fine. I've done my job. I have informed you, but just please understand the bad guys don't sleep. All right. So, John, you had mentioned something about a multi-layered security approach and how, just the standard, I'm going to put a firewall in to, protect myself from the outside world because, I don't want the hackers to get into my network over an internet connection. Well, that's not really good enough anymore. We have to start looking at stateful packet inspection, layer 7. These things have been out for a long time, but actually monitoring that, keeping our eye on this. One of the big pieces that I see now is that, we have so many vendors that are out there that'll sell us advanced threat protection products, and they'll create umpteen security alerts. But if my team is not trained on how to deal with that, it all just becomes cannon fodder and noise. And I almost create a rule that parks that somewhere in my inbox that I never check. And then all of a sudden I go back through 2 weeks later and see, oh, wow, we actually got hacked 2 weeks ago and I didn't go check the alert, so I haven't been in the console. So with that multi-layered approach and having all of these additional alerts, is there anything else that we can do? Can we feed this into a bigger system, like with a SIEM interface or something like that, to help get our hands around all this data and information we have? Because I'll tell you, when you set up monitoring from a security perspective, there are a lot of alerts, and there is a lot of data that gets fed in from that. So what have you seen in the field, and how do you deal with this, John?
Well, one good application, there are many, of the current burst in AI technology, right, is the ability to deploy some AI-grounded systems to help filter, analyze, properly route all those data streams that you're talking about. Because you're absolutely right. The more we defend, the more information we gain, the safer we are. But often it becomes so much noise, we can't hear the screams for help where they're coming from. So using systems that apply, more than rigid rules. We've had rigid rules for years, right, in our firewalls and different things, but less than human sets of eyes. So essentially artificial intelligence. Those types of tools are really working well to help us still build in more and more data for better informed, faster reaction times, that sort of thing, but yet not increase the labor requirement of adding more people or taking you away from your other responsibilities or that sort of thing. So I'm a big fan of looking at those dashboard monitoring type systems that leverage AI to provide you, even better, closer to real-time analysis of what you're gathering.
Yeah, and here's a little gold nugget for everybody that's listening, for all of our attendees. It used to be back in the day, there was an old saying, nobody ever got fired for buying IBM, Big Blue, right? And so now the new one is nobody ever gets fired for spending too much money on security. So the thing is that you've got to take and invest in your people, and you've got to take and invest in training, and you've got to invest in the right tools that they can have. I'm seeing the growth in cybersecurity is phenomenal right now, and organizations that are taking this seriously, that's probably some of the fastest growing teams that we're seeing from an IT perspective right now, John. All right, so along that point, user awareness and education. You can testify to this, John, because the thing is you deal with the executive branch of organizations all the time. This needs to start, as a top-down culture from the highest level executives all the way down. And we have to take the approach that, listen, it doesn't matter whose machine it is. If it's the CEO, if it's the chairman of the board, if it's anybody, and we detect that something weird is going on in their machine, we are going to immediately isolate those systems. We are going to analyze those systems, and we are going to try to find an immediate root cause and find a remediation path for them. Leaving them alone just because we're scared that we might be touching a top-level executive's machine is very, very dangerous. So that has to start from the top down. There has to be a level of understanding that all assets, all employees are going to be protected in a similar fashion. One of the big pieces that you have to look at for those key executives, they typically have their face on the public website. They're typically very noticeable figures that are out there, giving them education on, protecting themselves from social media, making sure that we have additional impersonation protections in place. The number of times I've talked to my customers and saying, well, Billy, the CEO of the organization, we just got impersonated again, and someone in the accounting department almost sent out another $50,000 wire on an urgent payment for a golf tournament that wasn't actually real. So put in measures in place where you'll actually physically phone the person before you do that stuff, because it's still happening. It's bad out there right now. So for user awareness and education, John, what are your thoughts on this piece?
Well, I really can only build on what you said. I am known. I go in organizations. One of the first things I try to work on is changing the culture so that the culture is isolate, then investigate. And that's the exactly what you were describing, right? If you have rats running around in your house, you don't chase them around trying to figure out which rooms they're in, because they'll be in all rooms. What you do is you lock all the doors to every room, and then you start investigating where they are. That initial reaction time is the most important thing. And if it isn't cultural, no matter what people say, they will hesitate when it hits the CEO, when it hits the CIO. I've had my own account locked out by that policy before. And my team member was very nervous to talk to me. And the first thing I said was, thank you. Thank you for following our plan and our strategy and our culture of isolate, then investigate. Because a few minutes of downtime is a heck of a lot better than hours or days worth, or even weeks. And of course, if you don't communicate that that's your culture, then it's not your culture. It's your personal belief or your department's belief. And that's not going to be very effective for you. So you have to get into the C-suite. You have to communicate with them and get them to buy into this concept that this type of culture saves money, saves resources in the long run. Once you convince them of that, then they will help you spread the message to everyone else in the organization, the rank and file, the partners, the customers, everyone else, that, hey, we are a secure first organization. Because, unfortunately, security is the enemy of convenience, and that's the era we live in. And IT, I've been in this long enough. When I got into IT, it was absolutely IT's purpose to provide convenience and efficiency for an organization. And a lot of that nowadays, I tell people, comes through the security that we implement.
Yes, John, and that convenience factor is huge. I actually had a friend of mine at one of the organizations I'm working with, and this is the line that he has. Security is not meant to be a matter of convenience. And so having that support and, having a few emails come out from your CEO saying that, hey, IT is actually doing a really good job. The security stuff is tough for everybody, but it's our corporate responsibility to follow our corporate policies and procedures. Having those emails come down as a top-down email blast always helps, right? All right. So the next one is backup and disaster recovery, and the importance of having that comprehensive disaster recovery plan. It's not listed on the slide. It should read cyber DR recovery plan, okay? And inside of there, you have to go through what are called red teaming and blue teaming exercises where you simulate somebody coming in and attacking your organization. I was recently at a conference, John, and the city of New Orleans was recently attacked, and their CIO was up on stage during the keynote. And one of the key factors of them being able to recover as quickly as possible, it was a very bad situation. They had just, as a team, 2 weeks prior, gone through a comprehensive, real-time prep of that DR plan, preparing what was going to happen 2 weeks prior to the big attack. So when it happened, everybody knew what they were going to have to do. I do a lot of presentations with my wife, Crystal, and she's told me that, going through and reviewing that plan and trying to practice it while you're in the middle of a disaster is absolutely the wrong time. It's not going to work. It's going to be brutal. So you need to make sure that cyber DR plan is written, the time is put into it, everybody buys into it, and you have to practice and model those scenarios. And what modeling some of those scenarios might be is turn off all the systems, because that's one of the first things that you do in a massive cyber attack, John, is you pull the plug. Can the organization survive with that? You're never going to know unless you actually go through a test. And never testing it saying, well, we should be fine, is just not good enough. So, can you build on that a little bit, maybe with the importance of, having some of those offline and off-site backups, those uber immutable things that the bad guys can't get their hands on?
Well, so I want to just dovetail, because you in the world are one of the top people I've ever met with knowledge of DR, both functionally and conceptually, architectures and everything else. So, I always listen when you talk about DR, and what you said is so important. And I want to kind of take that and go into, as you mentioned, one of the areas where I spend a lot of time in cyber insurance, and something that I'm working with a lot of organizations right now, and that is properly quantifying cyber risk. And it's exactly what you said. You have to understand exactly what you lose in order to properly plan preventing its loss. And what do I mean by that? Well, I find regularly that most organizations, when I talk to them, what they tell me they can survive and how long they can go without the computer system, their RPOs, their RTOs, all those, I find are usually woefully woefully insufficient. Meaning the business, in an effort to save money and cut costs, said, well, we could live for 8 hours without that, that's fine. And then you have an outage, and the DR team is like, okay, well, we're within our our recovery time objective. We're doing good. And all of a sudden the business is going, we're getting, customer complaints and back charges and all this. And you're like, it's only been an hour. What's going on? Well, that's an inappropriate understanding of cyber risk. And what I've been working with companies to do is I'm like, if you can't go through and say, hey, I'm a trucking company and I do work for John's Logistics. And if I don't pick up within a half hour when I'm supposed to be there and transmit my, electronic version of my bill of lading and all that kind of stuff, then they begin back charging me for every half hour I'm late or whatever. Well, so I can quantify that. That's something I can do on paper or on tabletop. But sometimes somebody's like, well, I don't think any of my customers are going to charge me or whatever. Well, I have actually gone as far to work with executive teams and be like, it's important enough to understand that you may want to reach out to your customers and schedule a pull the plug exercise and say, hey, we're going to, with our teams, actually introduce a controlled disaster to see what it impacts. And so now I take away the computer systems and my truck aren't moving, and John's Logistics gets a hold of me and says, hey, we had an agreement you would be here and we're doing this or whatever. And you're like, okay, well, obviously they're going to back charge me. And I start building a proper quantification of cyber risk. Once I have that, then I can properly adjust my RPOs, my RTOs, how many off-site backups I need, how many layers I need, what kind of staffing I need, and all that. Because I can tell you, it's not going to make you feel better. It's not going to make your team feel better. It's not going to make your organization feel better. It's not going to make the customers you serve feel better when you have a disaster, a ransomware locks you down, and you go, well, I didn't realize that being able to recover in a week wasn't going to be good enough. Well, it's too late to realize it now. Somebody just lost their job, or we lost an account or something like that. You have to get in front of this stuff.
Awesome, John. Hey, we have a really good question that just came in from Viola here, and I'm just going to read it off. It's fantastic. Thank you very much, Viola, for this question. And it's, given the rise in remote work scenarios, it is evident that an increasing number of employees are leveraging work-related applications on their personal devices. Oh, John, we fight this all the time. However, situations where data is permitted on non-protected endpoints, it becomes crucial to establish the most effective industry standards for safeguarding company assets. This challenge arises due to the delicate distinction between private and company usage. What would you recommend to protect data in this scenario? And this hits so close to home, Viola, because John and I fight this battle all the time. This, in fact, was part of the rise during the COVID-19 world pandemic of the rise of ransomware. Because, guys like John and myself, we got phone calls. We have sent everybody home today. We need to get VPN set up for everyone. And we're like, well, to what? To their home PCs. Okay, those don't really have our advanced threat protection. I don't care. We need to operate the business. Oh, okay, it's not a good idea, but sure. And so that happened in many organizations, just blasted out VPNs as fast as they could. And so the answer now is that if you want comprehensive and complete autonomy of those remote endpoints for those workers that are still working from home, buy them a corporate device, get them a dedicated VPN, get them a dedicated internet connection, and your problem goes away. Because my issue with this entire scenario is that you have zero control over what somebody does in their personal and private life on that home PC, and corporate data does not belong on there. And so the moment that I try to put some type of corporate advanced threat protection, and I can see everything that's going on their personal device, they have a big problem with it. And rightfully, they have that, they have that right to have that issue. But if you want complete autonomy, you got to make the investment and either give them a remote access solution that you can protect and contain what data comes off, so some type of remote connectivity through a Citrix farm or something like that. Or if you want complete control, dedicated VPN, dedicated device. Heck, John, we're even sending out Starlink rapidly deployable networks to employees now so that we can control this. And it's a big problem,
yes,
and it really hits close to home. And thank you very much for that, Viola. So, John, just a couple of things. What would you add to that?
Yep, just a couple seconds. And I'm going to be unconventional and in some cases unpopular here, as I am. What I tell people is, yes, you can support BYOD, but you better darn well do it awesome. Okay? It isn't just about you signing up for Intune or AirWatch or anything else. It's about you knowing how to tailor it like a expert, like the top 1% expert in it. Because if you're not doing that, it's just creating extra risk because you're adding extra complexity and holes and that sort of thing. So I do take the approach you say, Dave, and I tell people, nope, we can't afford to support BYOD because we can't support managing it properly. So we're going to issue corporate devices. That is the cheaper alternative. And we're not going to prevent people from putting personal information on corporate devices. That's a whole lot easier for us to manage than corporate information on personal devices. What that means is if they want to take a personal picture, fine, have at it, as long as it doesn't violate ethical or moral standards, legal, whatever. But do understand that if the company has to protect themselves by remotely wiping the device or something else and you lose that picture, you lose that picture. And people don't like that. And I'm sorry, there's parts of our jobs that we don't like. But ultimately, protecting the organization is the crucial fact, as Viola mentions here. And that means that you have to implement some standards that you can execute on awesomely. Right? If you can execute awesomely, then absolutely go ahead and support and be as broad as you can. But Dave, you know me, I've been unpopular enough where I've told people, hey, we're only going to use this one type or one model of phone, and they're always like, well, why can't I use mine? Why can't I use Android versus iOS? And I'm like, because for the company, I need a phone to be able to provide XYZ functionality. Why would I invest extra money in being able to support 5 different devices when they all provide the functionality? Why not have one, support one, pay for support of one, and call it a day? And that's the business decision.
Well, and back to that data loss prevention, John, how many of you listening on this call today allow your users to connect Office 365 email to whatever devices they deem fit? This could be on their kid's iPad. Their kid could be playing a game on their iPad, clicking on whatever, and down there is like corporate email pop-ups popping up, right? So all of a sudden you've got this personal device with corporate data on it. We've had to actually draw a line in the sand, John, and say, no, that's not allowed anymore. And we're only going to allow that on corporate devices now because you have no control. Now all of a sudden your kid clicks on a pop-up or a link or whatever, and the bad guy's on that device, and now they have access to all your corporate email. They're like, how did that happen? I don't understand how I got hacked. That's a big part of it. And so that, and also the battle that we face with the new MFA world that we live in, thou shalt not put an MFA application on my personal phone. Perfect. Okay, company's got to come up with a decision now. If you're not going to follow the standards that we have, then 2 choices. Maybe don't work here. That's a harder one. Or B, you're going to have to carry a corporate device as well. Well, I don't want to carry 2 cell phones. Oh my gosh, John, how often do we have to face that battle? It's all the time. All right, moving on. Now, back to your whole rapid recovery and response. One of the big pieces here, John, is practice, practice, practice. You're not going to be able to rapidly respond to anything unless you model and practice these scenarios, and the business needs to buy in. So that whole unplug the network, we're going to model a disaster. That is an absolute must, right? Now, in the event that something does happen, there are considerations that you have to take in place. For example, in the United States, I'm from Canada, so we would contact our Royal Canadian Mounted Police, our equivalent of the FBI. And so, that's part of it. Considerations for contacting law enforcement, your considerations inside your cyber insurance policy. They will have their own team of cyber forensic experts. How are you going to isolate those machines? John's analogy of the rats in your house. Got to close all the doors. We got to isolate. How are you going to utilize those backups? How are we going to go through these pieces? These are all really, really important parts. And John, I'm actually going to give you the next slide coming up here, because this one here is so important, is that, we're talking about the recovery part of a ransomware attack, not just protecting the recovery. And so how would you go through and do this? You do this as part of your day job. How would you go through and how would you make sure that your team is ready for when that ransomware attack happens?
So thanks, Dave. This is something that I work with teams every day, and it involves, the conventional items that we always talk about, which is, continual training, team discussion, that sort of thing. But it also, in my mind, for the best results, involves some, we'll say, more modern or newer concepts, such as I will often conduct the simulated scenarios in the same way that we conduct phishing scenarios for our users, right? Where we send out the emails without telling them, hey, this is a test email or whatever, and we see who clicks and who doesn't and that sort of thing. So I have been known, very unpopularly, I might add, to simulate a significant system failure within an organization, have the IT team notified as if it was real, have them respond as if it was real, to see that everybody knows what their role is, how they're going to do it, and to evaluate how they execute. Where are the gaps in knowledge? Where's the gaps in understanding the role that they're supposed to play versus the role others play? Where's the gap in attitude? Sometimes, even though people on the team agree, hey, yeah, I understand that if we have an emergency on a weekend, I'm going to have to come in. But I have had the scenario where they're like, well, I have a softball game this weekend. I'm sorry, I can't come in. Well, if you're trying to recover from an outage, that's a big deal. And I would much rather know that that's their attitude beforehand. And nobody's going to tell you that's their attitude. You have to find that. And that's how I find it, is I do these unpopular, unscheduled scenarios. And same thing with cloud outages, as you discussed in red team, blue team. But I remember, I think it was a year ago during COVID, you and I coined the term, we need to add a cloud team in there, right? We have to be able to try and poke holes and puncture our cloud resources, because to your point earlier about remote work, you know me, I deploy a lot of Azure virtual desktops and that sort of thing to control who's connecting to my environment and how. Well, what happens if those become unavailable? What does it take the team to restore them? That sort of thing. I've been known to go in and take one intentionally offline and then see how long it takes the cloud administrators on the team to determine that's what the root cause is, that's how I recover, this is what I do. It's not really popular, and it doesn't make you your team's favorite, but it does make them better, it makes your team better, and it makes your organization better.
Awesome, John. Fantastic guidance. Fantastic. All right. John and I have been part of 12, now I think 13 ransomware recovery teams since, going on probably back to, early 2020. And this is what it always starts like. It always starts with a phone call. I get the phone call from, the customer or friend or, somebody finds me and they're like, hey, yeah, and you can just heck the stress and the panic in their voice. Yeah, so we're getting ransom notes printed off on every printer in the organization. And now the executive panic sets in and the panic in the IT team sets in. First thing you're going to do is stay calm. You know, it's no different than dealing with any other type of disaster. There's frameworks in place. You know, you can take and you can follow some of the frameworks even that, you know, disaster organizations like Red Cross follow. You know, you have to be structured with this. Number one thing is that I'll tell organizations, take your firewall and unplug it from the internet because that's how the bad guys are getting in. Stop that. Okay, that's step one. All right. Now, what we're going to go through here is a quick review of the single biggest ransomware payload delivery in history, John. And this was the Kaseya breach of 2022. I had a friend that was running a MSP, and they were using this as their IT, you know, solution management tool for all their customers. What they didn't realize at the time was that the Kaseya agent that was loaded on there had some fine print, and it said, hey, if you want to lock this down, follow this, you know, 10-page guide. And by the way, we're going to install our agent by default with system-level credentials on everything. Oh, well, if you know anything about Windows credential management, system-level access is actually better than administrator. You're basically God-level rights inside of everything. So they had a supply chain attack, and the Kaseya Cloud platform was breached, and the bad guys were able to deliver their payload via this mechanism. So instantly, 60 customers were ransomed, whole level ransomed. Not 60 machines, 60 customers. You want to know what the going rate for the recovery key for your organization was? It's $50,000 per device for a recovery key, or $3 million for the organization. They didn't even know what they got, the bad guys. This was the Revel ransomware strain that was delivered, and they didn't even know what they got. They just launched this thing, and bam, everything is encrypted. And so, you know, around the world, this was huge. You know, this hit all the major news outlets, everything. And so I got the phone call from my buddy that was running the MSP. He's like, listen, I just need help. Like we're at our wit's end. We can't recover all of this. Please help. So they gave me a couple customers to deal with. And so basically what we had to do was go in and analyze what was going on inside of there. They did have cyber insurance, so that was good. So they had cyber insurance. The cyber insurance, that phone number was inside the policy. We called that number. They had a series of forensic experts. And so one of the big pieces of advice here is that if you're the outside consultant, you're not necessarily going to be able to consult in this situation unless you get approved and added to that list. Please, if you're that consultant, get yourself added and approved to that list before this happens because it just delays everything. So anyways, we were able to take a look at what was going on inside of here. And we were very quickly determined that, you know, this organization didn't have a secure fabric. They had a very flat attack surface. It was a single domain. They were running domain administrator. Domain administrator had rights to log into everything. We try not to do that in today's world. But at the end of the day, the attack compromised everything, including all of their backup targets. And so, you know, very quickly through this process, and this was interesting because this was a Canadian organization, so we don't have the same sanctions that you do as in the U.S. where you're not allowed to, you know, have outbound payments. They're starting to bring that in, but we don't have the same strict regulations. If we did have that, we would be in very big trouble because we actually ended up having to pay because we had no other choice. And this was very interesting because when the decision was made that we have no choice left but to pay, we're going to try to unlock the backup server because that has access to all of our backups and now we can recover. Okay, so we decided that we're going to pay. Everybody decides, okay, that's the great decision. How long did this actually take? So, okay, cyber insurance, we're going to pay. Yes, we agree. It's a good idea to pay. Let us talk to our lawyers. 2 days later, the lawyers come back. Okay, this is where you're going to wire the funds. we decided we're going to try to just do this with one machine. So send them the $50,000 to the lawyers so that they could, put this into trust or whatever. Okay, then there's another set of lawyers that this needed to go to. And then they needed to and they had the negotiators come in from the cyber insurance teams that are going to negotiate with the bad guys. And it's like a business. And so eventually, 3 days later, they determined, okay, so then they get the decryption key back. Another 3 days had gone by. Now we need to test the decryption key. So now we need to send them a test file that's encrypted to make sure that the decryption key actually works. They can go back to the bad guys and they can say, yes, the key that you gave us actually works. Thank you very much. And then you realize that the decryption process actually isn't fast at all because it took us 3 days to decrypt all of our backups on the backup server. I don't know if you're doing any spitball math with me here, John, but we were like at 11 days of being down even after we decided to pay to get the key to actually get back. And so this organization was an engineering firm that I was dealing with, and they were down. Like, there was nothing we could do. I couldn't do anything until I could get their domain controllers and other things back. We couldn't get them back online for a period of probably about 3 weeks. And then the recovery effort started. So basically people are sitting at home. The organization is, much longer if that goes on, customers are going to leave. They're going to go somewhere else. And it's bad, right? And so when we look at this, okay, if you're going to take anything away from our session, we had a little slide in there that said offline backup targets, okay? Not just immutable. I mean turned off. Because in that situation, John, if I gave the customer the option of being down for over a month and all the pain of rebuilding everything for probably 3 months that went on after that, which is a very fast recovery actually, they would have been very, very happy to say, listen, we're going to roll everything back a week. We're not going to pay for this stuff. And let's start now. We can start with we bring in the offline backup target, bring in the offline, backups that we had from the offline vendor or wherever that's going to come from. We'll take the week's worth of loss. We'll rekey whatever. We'll redraw drawings. We'll redo stuff. Because in that situation, even although your data might be 1 week old, 1 week old is more than sufficient in that particular situation. So make sure that you prepare for the ransomware event. Make sure that you have a recoverable strategy. And our biggest goal is so that you don't have to pay, right? So, it could mean wiping and reloading stuff with backups and restoring stuff, but make sure you have the possibility of recovering. And that's kind of the whole point of the summit. And so with that, John, we've got a couple minutes left. I'll leave it with you for some kind of closing comments here. And thanks everyone for attending here today. So John, kind of closing thoughts?
Thanks, Dave. It's been great chatting with you about this subject and with all the attendees. As we mentioned at the beginning, it's so much fun. We really do enjoy this time, and I appreciate all the questions that came in. It's great to have these interactive sessions. I mean, you and I both do this in person, and we do it online. If you have a question or a comment or a way to join in, please do. We're all here to help one another. And that is probably the best advice I can give you when it comes to ransomware prevention and recovery is remember, we're all part of a team working towards the same goal. So even if we said some things that maybe, hey, I don't really like that whole not using personal devices or whatever, that's okay. It doesn't mean that we're not on the same team focusing on the same goals. It just means that what fits for me doesn't fit for you. That's fine. But please think about what we've said, particularly some of the more architectural concepts on how to protect your organization and your recoveries, and let us know if we can help. And until next time, everybody have a great day. And Gladys, I'm going to turn it back over to you now.
Thanks so much, John and Dave. Yet another super engaging and informative session from you all. And we look forward to having you guys back in a couple of weeks. I think we have a couple of summit sessions with you guys in the docket.